Well, thank you, Arwa, so much for being here. We're at ZegFest in Tbilisi, and it's an amazing place to get to have this conversation.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. And for people listening, if you don't know and admire Arwa as much as I do, I think you will by the end of this conversation.
That's very sweet of you to say.
You know, we're here now. I'm back globetrotting again. We're in Tbilisi. I understand you're going to Beirut after this, and then maybe Cairo and all these places. I mean, you are on the road quite a lot right now. Can you tell me what Inara is doing right now, the work that you are up to at the moment?
It's all been a bit crazy because, as you know, I was a senior correspondent at CNN for forever. Right. And then
many questions for you about
this.
Yes.
And then I left in June 2022. And I think a part of me thought, oh, okay, now I'll have a bit more agency over my own time. And the absurdity of all of it is that I have literally found myself traveling more in the last 3 years than I ever did at CNN. I mean, I think the maximum amount of time I spent sleeping in my own bed was maybe 4 consecutive nights in a row. And a lot of it is because, I was shooting this documentary, but then the world went mad, and it was the Turkey-Syria earthquake, and then it was Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and trips to Afghanistan and Ukraine. And a lot of it was because of the work that my charity Inara was doing that just kind of, thankfully, exploded in a massive way. Gaza, because I'm the only person from Inara. We have a team in there, of course, and they're brilliant, but I'm the only person from the outside who was going in, mostly because, we don't have insurance, and I'm not going to risk anyone else's life. And obviously for this Inara staff in Gaza, they don't have a choice, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about all of that, but I guess I want to get a better sense of what Inara is right now. So this organization, I have memories of it starting with very specific medical treatments for individual cases. Very powerful stories. It seems like the mission has really expanded.
No, so we did start out very heavily focused on these individual medical cases, children that basically other organizations either weren't treating or they would get their first surgery or second surgery, but a lot of them are burns cases. And so at some point the treatment stops. And then from there, we've kind of expanded into taking on significantly more medical cases, incorporating mental health, because you can't just heal someone physically. You have to also try to address the underlying psychological traumas.
Of course.
To now, depending on where it is that we're working, having a very expansive sort of holistic approach, still with the child at the center of it, but, education, housing, access to clean water, a rapid response program like the one we have in Gaza right now that basically is anything that you can actually get your hands on and then get to the people who need it, along with medical clinics and a very robust mental health program. And so we've kind of just gone huge, comparatively speaking, in a very brilliant way.
Yeah, you're still a small operation,
yes, we are small
and a very
compared to others,
boutique or intimate, in whatever word you might want to use for it.
First of all, I think what kind of differentiates us a lot is, even though technically we're international, everywhere we are, we operate as if we were a local entity. And so everything, the design of the specific program, the people who work for us are of the communities that we are trying to serve, because people need to have agency over the assistance that they're receiving, because that's what war does to you, right? It strips you of everything. And so if at the very least, as a humanitarian community, we can actually give someone, an adult or a child or whoever it is, what it is that they actually need and respect their wishes and dignity, that has huge significance and even greater impact.
You've mentioned your work inside Gaza. You've been there 5 times?
4 times.
4 times. Okay. Can you just talk a little bit about what it's like to go there right now?
I kind of wish I could properly describe it, but actually, Josh, it doesn't matter how much of the footage you see, it doesn't even come close, because, the camera shoots straight in front of you. But when you're in there, you see the 360 view of it. And I remember the first time I went, and this was back, well over a year ago, when Rafah was still open and everyone was down kind of in that area in particular. And the car driving through, and it took us maybe like 3 hours to go a distance that should have taken 15 minutes. And it was just because we were driving through this sea of people. And I always look at people's faces, and I try to kind of look into their eyes. And then I turned to my friend who's from Gaza. And I was like, is it just me, or are people here dead? Am I staring at The Walking Dead?
The Walking Dead.
And she said, no, you are. And it's that light,
Yeah.
that light that we all have in our eyes. And a lot of the times you look at these sea of faces in Gaza and it's gone.
Yeah.
And I kept trying to say to myself, like, what is differentiating Gaza from everywhere else that we've been, right? Because we've been everywhere.
Because you've been to war zones and you've
and
seen
you know,
people who've experienced
and you
trauma
see
and
destruction and you see death. In Gaza in particular, it's beyond the depth and breadth and scope of what has happened in such a short, condensed period of time.
Yeah.
It's the psychological crushing and obliteration of a person's soul. And part of it is also because in these other war zones, right? So like, ISIS in Mosul, families that were trapped in these areas went through horrific experiences. But then at some point in time, it was, well, if you're surviving, you're able to like get somewhere, that's it, you're out. Yeah. You're okay.
The possibility exists. Even
in
if
Gaza,
it's not.
There is no okay. There is no, if I survive the bombing today, I'm going to be okay tomorrow. Yeah. If I'm able to get to this food source, it's not a fleeting food source. It's actually a permanent, sustained one. That in a lot of the other war zones, the humanitarians are kind of one step removed from sort of the direct area where the violence is happening. And when the population is able to get to them, that's it. You're going to get your food, your water, your shelter, your medical, treatments and needs. In Gaza, the humanitarian community is inside. It's in it. And we still cannot provide.
Yeah. I wonder what that experience is like for you, if it's different to go into these places, or maybe specifically Gaza, as a humanitarian than if you were as a journalist. Are there things you either can do that you couldn't have done, or are there things you see that you wouldn't have seen? Do you perceive it differently?
I don't think my perception of it is different in the sense that, the mind is always sort of looking at the scenes around and kind of, writing or trying to tell stories and trying to figure out how you're going to describe it. And I think, even in the humanitarian space, I still obviously do a lot of storytelling because I think, things aren't that siloed anymore, nor should they be. The humanitarian community does have an obligation to actually humanize the population that is in need. But I mean, yes, obviously you're operating in to a certain degree, very different spaces. So, if I were in Gaza as a journalist, under these conditions, you'd be going to the aftermath of strikes and trying to actually see and determine who was really in this building. Why was this kind of weaponry being used? A lot of the work that, Palestinian journalists are doing right now, who, tragically and inexcusably are being sidelined by, a lot of their colleagues on the outside.
I'm very conscious of conversations I've had this whole weekend, and I'm sure you've been part of them too, where we say there are no journalists in Gaza, which is a statement that is true if you don't include the Gazan journalists.
Exactly. And the other thing to also take into consideration too, though, and this is again a sad, tragic reality of the sort of despicable world that we exist in right now, is that because they haven't been assigned, or because they are not being permitted that level of credibility that the international journalists would be getting, it also then allows Israel to continue perpetuating its false narratives. And when the international media isn't in there, the international media, and especially the Western media, like, let's be clear about that, and especially when it comes to Israel, it's the American media, cannot and does not know how to, nor does it have the will to push back on some of these false narratives that are continuously sort of permeating the psyche, right? We hear it over and over again, repeat a lie often enough and it becomes real. Yeah. And I should also point out here that I've been denied entry into Israel on my 5th attempt to go in February and March. And
do you have a sense of why that is?
I don't, because you never get an official reason why. And the thing is, if it is because of my journalistic background, then it begs the question of, well, why did you let me in 4 times? Right. And could it be possible that, one of the world's, greatest, intelligence apparatuses didn't realize that I worked at CNN for 17 years before transitioning over into the humanitarian space, and I just, slipped under the radar 4 times. But then again, I've been very outspoken from my first trip in. So you never know.
Yeah.
But it also comes at a time.
Or it could be because of that, right? It could be because of your continued storytelling.
It could be, but also it comes at a time when there's been roughly 30 to 40% of an increase in denials of entry among humanitarians and those who are attempting to go in on medical missions. And so, we've tried to find patterns and apply logic as to why some people are being denied, and there is no pattern. Yeah. There's people that have been greatly outspoken who have been permitted entry, and there's people who haven't uttered a peep who have been denied.
We were talking about the sort of dearth of international reporters, and of course there are wonderful Palestinian journalists, but there is something about the international journalistic community.
Yeah. Here's the other thing also. It's also in like how you storytell, right? So if you look at a lot of the content that's coming out from, these incredible Palestinian journalists, like, yes, they're giving us facts and figures. They're giving us, the horrific footage of the direct aftermath of the impact. Like, we understand all of that, but the sort of shaping of the story, the way that it does often get shaped by, Western journalists for a Western audience, is not something that they've necessarily been trained on, nor is it something that they have the capacity for. Let's not forget, they're not, going out into the field and then all of a sudden going back somewhere comfortable to sleep. They're also hungry. They're also scared. They're also being slaughtered. Their families are also at risk, and they're reporting on their own people and their own loved ones and the death of their own family members. And so all of that they're trying to carry. And yes, the tragic reality is that, we, the West, want to see stories reported by people who look like us. And there's a very clear reason why Israel is not allowing the foreign media into Gaza. And I have this thought every single time I'm there, is that if this space was open to the entire press corps, it would be over tomorrow, because 99% of what Israel is saying unravels the minute you set foot in Gaza. From the very basic line of Hamas controls the aid. I can tell you as a humanitarian, until I'm purple in the face, no, Hamas does not control the aid. You put the Western press corps in there so they can actually see that Hamas does not control the aid, and they can actually see the criminal gangs that are doing the looting. It completely blows up the Israeli false narrative.
I wonder if we could back up just a little bit and talk about how you made this transition from journalism to Inara. I'm curious about what motivated it. What made you feel like the work you were doing as a journalist? I've heard you talk about the war in Syria in particular, in a sort of sense of the limits of what we can achieve, being a kind of a catalyzing moment for you. Do you think you can just talk a little bit about that experience?
We've all gone through this, right? That sense of like the work isn't having the impact that it should, especially when you're reporting on, war or revolution or whatever it is, and you're seeing the death of so much that's around you. And we all go into this industry, especially in that space, with the idea of, I'm going to make a difference. Yeah. Right? If we uncover and we show the world what's happening, things are going to course correct into the right direction. Yeah. And then you're hit with the brutal reality of, actually, no, that's not how things work. Yeah. And for me, it was really Syria that kind of sunk me into the mental equivalent of a dark cesspool. And it was, what more can I do than just watch all of this? Yeah. And then I was remembering all the stories that we'd done of like trying to help kids and all the kids I'd met that I wasn't necessarily able to help. And it sort of over time crystallized into, well, why not build an organization so that all of us who are out there in the field, when we come across people who need help that we can't, report on, or when we do the report, they don't get the treatment that they need, we can all just plug into it. And then from there, it kind of grew. So,
I mean, I can relate to that completely, because Syria for me was also a turning point. Yeah. I remember going to a refugee camp early in the war in northern Lebanon and meeting some families in tents and telling their story and thinking, okay, this is important. Like, the world needs to know what's going on. And then 2 years later, a friend from another, visiting Beirut wanted to go to this same camp. And I thought, let's see what's going on there. And it was, if not the exact same families, it was the exact same situation. And he did pretty much the exact same story that I had done 2 years earlier. And my brain just went blank. I was just like, what are we doing here? I wonder, in your case, is it more about reaching your own personal limit of what you felt like you could do to your satisfaction as a journalist? Or is it about the limits of what journalism can achieve in these situations?
It's a bit of both. So at the time, obviously, I was still at CNN. And so I was going into Idlib province quite a lot. And everyone was saying, why are you going? You're risking your life. The Russians are bombing. And it's the same story. And I had to simultaneously sort of adjust what I hoped my journalism was going to do from that sort of grandiose idea of, hey, we're going to change the world to trying to figure out, like, why do I keep going back to these places? And in that, I kind of coalesced on the idea of, one, the victors don't get to be the only ones who have their version of history being told. So part of it is actually recording history. Mm-hmm. And part of it is this idea of just because the world is being apathetic towards something, just because there isn't necessarily a big viewer appetite for it, it's not going to be an A block story. That doesn't mean that it's not a story that is not worth telling. And so I think, a lot of it was that. And then also a lot of it was, obviously journalism does have its limitations, but as journalists, we're also problem solvers. If someone tells us, no, you can't go there, we're going to figure out a way to get there. And so I've always had that thinking. And so for me, it never made sense. Why should a 5-year-old kid who has catastrophic burns on his face not be able to access medical treatment? Yeah. Like, that's something that we should be able to solve, right? It doesn't make sense to me that we can't. And so it kind of extrapolates from that whole sort of problem-solving mindset, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a more nuanced answer you're giving because, of course, we do see that there's some value in journalism and we do it because we believe in it.
Yeah, no, and I still believe in journalism very, very strongly.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, to hear you say that. Because I do too, but I always find myself saying it with 1,000 caveats around the way.
Yeah, because I think we think it's supposed to change so much.
Maybe it's our own expectations.
It is. And I think that, that's what we go into, right? We're young, we're naive, we're idealistic. But I think, part of it is, for me, it was like the little things. Like I remember I was once on a plane going to Greece and this guy stopped me. This was during the sort of refugee crisis. It's like, there's a report that you did that I saw that made me want to come volunteer. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you don't necessarily see the impact of what you want. And we're expecting impact at sort of the massive geopolitical level. Whereas we need to look for the impact maybe at the lower levels. And then the other thing is, if journalism ceased to exist, that world terrifies me 1,000,000 times more than anything does at this point in time.
That's what Gaza is a bleak kind of dystopian view into is what the world might be if there's no journalists from the outside world.
If there's no journalists, you've got, the world's greatest self-declared democracy that is, backing another self-declared democracy that is literally carrying out the annihilation of an entire population in blatant view of everyone to see. And add to that, taking away humanitarians' capabilities inside to even be able to provide something as basic as a bar of soap or a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
It's actually mind-blowing. It is so illogical.
Is it liberating to be able to speak this clearly? Because that would have been hard for you to do at CNN. I know you very well, so I know that you did not hold your tongue.
I didn't.
You had a real knack, and I've heard you talk about this too. You had a knack for, navigating controversial stories by showing what was happening, by just pointing the camera and describing what you're seeing. And you were very effective at that, but you still probably had to be a little thoughtful about your language.
I've wondered that a lot too. If I was still at CNN, what would I have said on air? And the thing is, I always said what I wanted to say because I was always reporting what people were telling me, and it's their words. And I find myself wondering quite a bit why some of my colleagues, either, at CNN or the other networks, aren't trying to reach more into, call it the Palestinian space, or even now with the Iranian space. I probably watched since Israel bombed Iran and then Iran retaliated, maybe like 10 hours over the last few days of mostly CNN and BBC coverage, because I was actually looking for this. I did not once in those 10 hours hear anything about the Iranian civilian death toll. And that's not something that's hard to incorporate into your live shots, even if you're standing in Israel. It's one sentence. And this many civilians died in Iran. Yeah. When Gaza, post October 7th, and then, Israel began bombing Gaza, and everyone was there, sort of ducking the sirens and whatnot. It takes an extra sentence to say, but in Gaza, they don't have sirens. So that was always something that I would incorporate into my reporting, even if I wasn't on the ground somewhere. And, when you're reporting on what someone else is telling you, if someone in Gaza is telling me, I feel like I'm being annihilated. I feel like, my access to clean water, to food, to healthcare, to everything is just being stripped away from me. As a journalist, I have a responsibility to report what that person is saying to me. That is journalism.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would do at CNN. Now I say it because I've seen it myself. But when you're not there, there's ways to tell the story.
Yeah. I think that there's been I don't want to call it quite a critical mass, but there's been a significant number of people from our sort of cohort of people who covered Middle East who have left journalism, who've gone into helping professions. I can think of a dozen or so who have gone into social work or nursing or public health. I wonder if you have thoughts about that trend, why that happens. And I guess sort of as a related question, do you worry about the state of journalism now losing those people? Like, is there a collective memory about the lessons we've learned over the last 10, 20 years about being safe and ethical reporting?
I am worried about journalism losing some of the sort of institutional lived knowledge and experience that, some of us gathered through, because we're the cohort of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring, and then the fall and the many deaths that happened in that period of journalists.
And also, the U.S. military strategy at the time, and coming up against and trying to fight back against what was, U.S. military propaganda and the dehumanization campaign that, America and its allies carried out post 9/11, and sort of the insane parallels that you see right now between that. And I think for me, another quite terrifying moment was, so it was post 9/11 America that actually pushed me into journalism because I'm Syrian American.
Right.
And I would have thought that we as an industry, specifically Western media, would have learned the lessons of post 9/11 quite well by now. And then there was post October 7th. And it was like post 9/11 on steroids. Mm-hmm. So yes, I am very worried. As for why some of us have gone more into the sort of humanitarian and direct assistance sector, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where, you do the journalism and then you put it out there and you don't necessarily see the impact. And you get to maybe a certain point in time where you have this craving to do something where you're going to directly see the benefit of it. Because let me be clear on one thing, Josh. Humanitarian work, social work, like that whole space where everyone's like, oh my God, you're such a good person for doing that. No. And this is why I don't understand why more people don't do it. It allows you to feel good about yourself. It gives you your raison d'être, your reason for being. It is a rush.
Even if a little bit, because it's also, you're exposed to a tremendous amount of trauma.
Yes, no, you are. But
by comparison to journalism, where we see somebody in a horrible situation and then we go back to a nice hotel.
Yeah, and we don't know, we don't know what's happened to them.
We know nothing about it.
We don't know what the journalism has done to actually, help them out. Now you can. And, I remember at one point in time in my career at CNN, for vacations, I used to go and build houses with Habitat for Humanity.
Wow.
Because I had that craving. My brain needed to be able to put one brick on top of another and know that I had done something for somebody that I could see.
That's so interesting. You are doing important work. I know that you naturally resist some of these sort of accolades, and certainly resist this notion that you are now living in a world filled with hope because you're doing something that's more in a helping
No, we've
world.
already had that conversation.
We already
I don't
had that
have
conversation.
hope. I don't need hope. And let me also just be clear. I mean, yes, Inara has taken over all of my time and everything, but that very much for me is still, it's a passion project, and it's something I do as a volunteer. I don't know where I'm going next.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This episode was recorded in Tbilisi by audio recorder and editor Zura Patsia. Special thanks to everyone at the Zeg Storytelling Festival for making this possible. The Kicker is a production of the Columbia Journalism Review. Amanda Dara is the producer and editor. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.